Howdy, this is Browdy coming at you with the third and final video lecture for ecology, and actually the final video lecture of the year. And so we have talked about a number of things up to this point, and this is kind of the last little spin, and you might notice that there's no notes and slides today. It's just the notes. And so this is a little different than I've done things in the past, but this is something that I wanted to end with that is relevant to what we've been talking about, but also something that I think is really important for you all to know, and that is nutrient cycles. And we're kind of taking a more personal spin on that. So we'll talk about it as we go. You've probably heard of cycles before, and so as they say in the note, or as the notes say, there is a fixed amount of matter on Earth, and that matter is constantly recycled between living and non-living things. And you might talk in other classes about what matter is, but it's never created or destroyed, it's just recycled in some way, shape, or form, specifically in terms of like elements being recycled in different forms, and that's kind of what we're looking at with nutrient cycles. And so the nutrient cycles that are really most important in biology are the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water cycles. Now, the water cycle you've probably heard of, and in its simplest form, you typically learn that as water evaporating from the oceans or ponds, lakes, whatever it is, and then going up into the atmosphere, condensing into clouds, falling as precipitation, and the process repeating. That's the very basic version of the water cycle, and that's totally right. The carbon cycle is the one that I want to focus on today, and I'll try to do this nice and quick. It's the last one. I don't want to keep you around too long. But so let's talk about what the carbon cycle is. Just like the water cycle, it's a cycle of carbon being found in different forms. So it's not just carbon, the element. It's found in different things, in different compounds and things like that. But carbon is, in fact, an element that is in all living things. So you have heard of organic before. Now you've probably heard organic as meaning expensive, or typically you've heard of organic as meaning like not grown with any preservatives or unnatural substances, which is technically true. But in science, organic actually means made of carbon. There's a whole form of chemistry called organic chemistry, and that's chemistry or the study of carbon-based compounds. And so the carbon cycle has a few different steps. Now in class, you would have gone through these and discussed them, but I'll just go through them each right now. And so the first one that I'll mention is photosynthesis. And we see this on this picture here represented as 3. And so what we see is carbon from the atmosphere going into a tree. That's photosynthesis. And think about how that's used. We know that trees and plants breathe in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. Now that's oversimplifying, but we know that CO2 and water and sunlight are used as the reactants of photosynthesis to produce glucose and oxygen. Right? We've studied that before in this class. It was last semester, but we've studied that. And so that's carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere being breathed in. Breathing being used loosely here, but being breathed in by trees and plants as a way of carbon going from the atmosphere into living things. Now on the flip side, number 2 here, respiration, we see here, we see here, and we see here. It's because there are living things in the water, living things on land, and there are animals on land, and there's of course plants. And those respire, right? Cellular respiration is the process of that's the opposite of photosynthesis, right? So we start with glucose and oxygen, and then that produces ATP instead of sunlight, but H2O and CO2. And so CO2 is released as a product of respiration, and so breathing or cells making energy produces CO2. So we have that cycle of photosynthesis and respiration. So all living things breathe out CO2. I'm going to skip a little bit here. But if all living things breathe out CO2 from respiration and plants get CO2, or not CO2, excuse me, just carbon in general. If plants get carbon from breathing that in for photosynthesis, animals obviously don't photosynthesize. So what do? Well, they consume. And so I'm jumping down here to number 5, but because it's relevant, right? We see the little animal here, whatever that is, looks like an animal cracker. But it's eating the plant. And so we get carbon as we eat plants. So this doesn't necessarily represent us, but just animals in general. And you'll notice these arrows are pointing towards the thing that carbon is going to. And so when you eat a salad, you're getting the carbon from those plants. If you eat an animal, you're getting the carbon that they consumed when they were eating producers of some sort, right? We've talked about this before. So that's consumption. Now I'm going to go back over here to decomposition, number 6. So when any of these things, living in any way, shape, or form, die, those decompose, right? So decomposers break down that carbon into different carbon compounds, but then that re-enters the soil and things like that. Now it enters the soil, but it also, more specifically in this case, gets broken down, and then we can also see that being compacted into fossil fuels. And so I'm going to skip down here to fossilization. So I'm going to talk about combustion in a second, but fossilization we see as things die, they can decompose, but they can also be fossilized, right? So not the best explanation of decomposers, but that's okay. Fossilization, then on the other hand, is when things die and they happen to be trapped in mud or under rock or whatever it is, but their bodies are preserved in some way, shape, or form, and so the carbon stays really rich, and that gets compressed over time with different layers and all the heat and pressure, and over millions of years, carbon-rich materials can be compacted into fossil fuels. And so, again, this is a pretty gross oversimplification, but it gets the point across. And so fossil fuels are things that we have like coal or natural gas or oil products. And so hopefully you've encountered some of those before, or familiar with those. And the way those get used most readily in our society is here with, so extraction, number one, is how we extract those fossil fuels. So through coal mines, gas mines, or fracking, mountaintop removal, all sorts of stuff like that, tar sands. But then once we have those fossil fuels, we combust them. We burn them as a source of fuel, a source of energy. And so if you have natural gas power, or if you have gas energy, coal-powered things are not as common anymore. But so we use fossil fuels for energy, right? We use oil in our cars, unless you drive an electric car, right? And so that is carbon that was stored in fossil fuels being extracted and then burned, because when you burn something, you're taking a carbon compound, you're burning it in the presence of oxygen. Sorry, I'm not sure why I'm saying burn so intensely, but you're burning it in the presence of oxygen, and that's producing CO2 and H2O. That's something we talk about in chemistry. So you're producing carbon dioxide when you burn carbon-based compounds. When you do that, you're putting carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere, where this whole thing started. Now, there's one that isn't on here, and that's diffusion, and that is actually the oceans absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is something that we've talked about a bit in class, or we'll talk in the future about in class. But the oceans actually sequester carbon, is what we call that, and they take carbon out of the atmosphere and absorb that into the oceans. Now, that can be an issue depending on the rates one way or another, but we'll talk maybe about that more later. So that's that. So how have humans altered this carbon cycle, and why is it important? Well, first and foremost, humans are extracting and then burning carbon compounds way faster than it can actually fossilize. So that in and of itself is a problem, because we are depleting these resources faster than they can be made. So we're going to run out of these at some point. That's the first thing. But on top of that, as we're burning these, we're adding carbon to the atmosphere way faster than the rest of the carbon cycle can remove it from the atmosphere, right? So the oceans absorbing carbon and trees sequestering carbon or absorbing carbon. That does happen, but we're pumping carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere, and it's accumulating here quicker than it can be taken up by all these other sources, because this happens at a slow, pretty natural rate, and we are, as far as really we're concerned, putting carbon dioxide out at an unnatural rate. Now I'm going to change kind of tunes here for a second, or we're going to change main themes. And this is something that we'll talk about in a movie that, depending on when you're watching this, you've either already watched in class or will watch in class, called Before the Flood, or any number of kind of climate-related movies. Depending on the year, we may or may not watch exactly that movie. But one of the things that we'll talk about is Earth is really in what we would consider to be a 6th major extinction. right now. So if you remember from History of Life, we talked about how there had been 5 major extinction events in Earth's history, all really being significant because a majority of the species on Earth at the time went extinct, died out, never to be seen again. And while it might not seem like we are in the midst of an extinction right now to us, that's largely because of the way we perceive time relative to time in terms of like Earth's history, right? We see time very quickly moving. You can count the seconds, we'll count the minutes, whatever, we go day to day. Whereas the biggest extinction in Earth's history, where 90+% of species went extinct, seems like only a blip in all of Earth's history, but it was actually over a 25 million year period, the Permian extinction, roughly 25. That's a long time, right? So in the relatively short time of just even industrialization, we can look back and see how many species have gone extinct. Not just animals, but plants as well, right? And if species are dying out, they're going extinct. And so while it might not seem like a very fast rate to us because we live such short lives compared to the planet, it's happening relatively quickly. And so some of the things that are causing that can be kind of summed up with this acronym HIPPO. Now, it's not the best acronym ever, but bear with me. So the H stands for habitat destruction. That is kind of straightforward. That could be anything from deforestation for paper, for palm oil, for fossil fuel harvesting, for mining, whatever it is. But habitat destruction. That could be coral reefs being destroyed for any number of reasons. And we'll talk more about that as we go. The I is invasive species. And so as humans travel place to place, we have been known to either intentionally or unintentionally bring other species with us. And so when species end up places where they weren't initially adapted for, they can sometimes outcompete all of the species that live in a certain habitat. And so as they do that, they're reducing biodiversity, because if one species is able to outcompete a number of species in a habitat, well, that's reducing the amount of species that can thrive there, and those species could well go extinct. Pollution is the first P, and that kind of speaks for itself, right? That could be plastic pollution in the oceans. That could be polluting the oceans with carbon dioxide or carbon from the air, and that's killing coral reefs. It could be pollution of the oceans with industrial runoff or urban runoff. It could be pollution of the air, right? So there's so many things that it could be considered pollution. The second P, and this is the stretch, is human over population, right? There's the P there. The human population is growing exponentially, right? It is growing very quickly. And so that's kind of a big deal. If we look at the human population in terms of history, it's growing, and then it's growing quite literally exponentially, right? And so think about the demands that we had on the world when we were just 1 billion people big, right? 1 billion people is a lot. Think about all the resources that would be needed. Well, think about how time has changed since then. Think about how industry and think about how technology has changed since then. Each person consumes more resources now than ever before, and we have 7.6 billion people, right? So there's more people, and each one requires more resources. Just think about the things that you've got, your phone, your computer, your house, whatever it is. Those things take energy. Those require resources. And then lastly, over-harvesting. So to accommodate that big population, think about how much food is grown across the world. Think about how much fishing occurs across the world. I know, at least at the time of showing this, the movie, or the time of recording this, the movie Seaspiracy, I think on Netflix, is really big, talking about the harm of overfishing. And so this is a big deal, and all these things together are really killing out species left and right. Now, there we go. Now I'm going to change kind of back to this sort of climate change sort of idea. Now, I haven't necessarily used that term yet, but really between all of these things, these kind of can be summarized in terms of climate change. And I'll get there, but I want to talk about greenhouse gases, and then I can kind of bring everything together. So the greenhouse effect is shown here, and to summarize it quickly, we see the sun, right? And the sun's radiation travels towards the earth in the form of ultraviolet light. among other things, and visible light as well. But some of that is absorbed, but about half is reflected or absorbed by the clouds and the atmosphere, while the rest reaches the earth where it's absorbed by the oceans or land. Well, some of that is released back towards space, and some of that can make it through the atmosphere, but a lot of it is captured and retained by what we call greenhouse gases. So that's a reference to a greenhouse where plants are grown and kept, right? And the idea there is that those are typically transparent or translucent so that heat and energy can be let in, but not easily escape. It's the same idea as if you're on like a cold, snowy day, maybe, or it's actually or a day where there's maybe snow out, it's cold, but it's sunny. If you're in the car, that heat can make its way into the car and then get trapped in the car. Even though it's really cold outside, you might be baking in the sun because of the greenhouse effect. And so it's almost like when you get cold in bed and you add blankets to retain that body heat, right? As we're adding carbon to the atmosphere, like we talked about before, just through the carbon cycle and kind of unevenly distributing carbon throughout the carbon cycle, that carbon gas is typically, it's not always carbon, but those carbon gases can act as what we call greenhouse gases. And these are gases that trap the sun's heat within Earth's atmosphere and kind of act as that like blanket effect. And while they are essential for life, small changes in their concentrations in the atmosphere can actually have really big effects. So the first one that I want to mention, my mouse froze there, is carbon dioxide. It's the main one that we talk about. And CO2 is kind of like the gold standard greenhouse gas. It's got some natural sources, like we mentioned in the carbon cycle. So decomposition and respiration releases CO2. But some human sources of CO2 are fossil fuel combustion, deforestation, industry, so just industrial production in general, and then transportation is a huge one, right? Cars, planes, buses, all different kinds of things let off carbon dioxide gas as a result of the internal combustion engine, right? And so we as humans have created a lot of sources of carbon dioxide that we on our own have put into the atmosphere. Now, we could talk at length about how we can track the CO2 in terms of which carbon it is a carbon 12 or 14. So we can actually tell that the carbon that is accumulating in the atmosphere is the same carbon that's being released from fossil fuels, but that's a different story. Now, methane. Methane is a different gas. Methane is what we used. If you've been in class when I've lit people's hands on fire for Halloween, methane is the one. That's what's in the gas jets on my desk. Now, methane is a greenhouse gas that is about 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So whatever effect a certain amount of carbon dioxide would have in terms of greenhouse gas or global warming potential, you could call it, methane traps about 25 times the amount of heat or energy. It's a big deal. Methane comes naturally from wetlands where things are kind of decomposing without access to oxygen and just, natural wetland decomposition. But industry and landfills, but actually livestock as well, are huge natural sources of methane. And I'm going to draw my attention to your attention to livestock here, because think about how much beef is in demand globally. Think about how many burgers get eaten in a given day. How many steaks are eaten, right? So beef is in pretty high demand globally. Almost every culture in some way, shape, or form incorporates beef. Now, when you think about that, think about how much cattle or how many cattle have to be raised daily globally to accommodate that demand, right? Now, how much of that even gets used? But cows need to be fed. They're living things that also respire. And when they are eating, they actually end up burping up a lot of methane. More so than they fart up, actually. They burp more methane than they fart. But that's one of the things that the gases that's produced in their gut. And cows burp methane, which might not be a big deal if it's a relatively small amount. But think about how big our population is and how how we're over harvesting resources, right? How we're overproducing things. Livestock falls right in that category. And so that is actually a huge source of methane globally. I'll keep going. Nitrous oxide is the next one. And this comes from a number of things. So fossil fuel combustion, deforestation, industry. No, sorry. I think that might have gotten copied over from here. I apologize. It's not supposed to be there. I was like, those don't seem right. It's always good to catch a typo. Some natural sources of nitrous oxide are decomposition. Again, that's they all fall into this category. But the big human source of nitrous oxide, and this is really the bigger point, sorry for that little slip up, is agricultural, soil management, and industry. So industry is kind of a pretty consistent one. But soil management is actually a huge source of nitrous oxide. And I'll talk about what nitrous oxide is in a second. So nitrous oxide, or nitrogen, is a nutrient that's really important for plants, as phosphorus is. And nitrates are really big in fertilizers and things like that. And so if agriculture is as big as it is globally, right, we don't often see it, but we know that all the food that we see has to come from somewhere. That takes a lot of soil nutrition and management. And so a lot of nitrates and nitrogenous compounds are going to get used in that process, which will often end up releasing a lot of nitrous oxide. Now, if carbon dioxide can be said to have like a global warming potential of 1, methane has 25, nitrous oxide actually has 300. It's a big difference. And so while this might not be as present as the others, its presence is also 300 times more impactful than carbon dioxide. So if you have 300 times the amount of CO2 as nitrous oxide, they're doing the same amount of damage, so to speak. And the last one are CFCs, and those are chlorofluorocarbons. So they're carbon-based gases that have fluorine in them. And those have no natural sources, but the biggest human source is refrigerants, so like artificial coolants. Now, these replaced things that had been discontinued because of ozone layer depletion, but CFCs can have a global warming potential really anywhere in the range of 1,000 plus. It's hard to pinpoint it exactly because CFCs are more of a category of gases as opposed to a specific gas. And so while these aren't, again, as abundant as the others, their presence alone is way more impactful than much more of these, right? So those are the 4 kinds of greenhouse gases. Now, what does this have to do with anything? As we're adding to the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, CFCs, that's creating this greenhouse effect, right? The more greenhouse gases there are, the more heat gets retained in the atmosphere, and the more damage that can do. And we can talk more about that as we go. But I specifically want to talk about CO2 here for a second. So you've probably at some point in time heard about climate change, right? So these gases, greenhouse gases, all of that, you might have heard global warming. It's not necessarily always warming, which is why the term climate change is preferred. And it's not really something that's in debate by scientists. It's often portrayed as being that way, and it really is not. And there's a lot of misrepresentation of graphs and things like that, and people will try to argue a lot of different ways, but from a scientific perspective at least, this isn't really something that is being contested. The importance of it is that climate change can have all different kinds of effects. A small change in temperatures globally can affect sea level, can affect weather conditions, can quite literally, of course, affect climate, can affect all sorts of different things, species dying out, a lack of biodiversity. And it's not that life can't survive. It's just that the kind of life that we want can't always necessarily survive, and it will cause some pretty serious, drastic changes in everyone's lifestyle. But that's getting a little bit beyond the scope here of what I want to talk about. I want to talk more about kind of the evidence that we have and kind of the facts. And so all of this said, carbon dioxide has historically been concentrated in the atmosphere roughly in the range of 180 to 280 parts per million. Now, how concentrated that is isn't necessarily so significant at this very moment, but parts per million is just a unit of measurement for concentration. So carbon dioxide is always in the atmosphere, and globally there are some peaks and troughs in terms of like highs and lows in carbon dioxide concentration. And so, yes, it's true if you hear someone say, well, the Earth has always had high concentrations of CO2 and low concentrations. It's a cycle. And that's true. But it's happened pretty gradually over time. what we're seeing is that in the last 300,000 years or so, it's kind of been in this range of 180 to 280, maybe occasionally spiking up to 300, but it's been thousands of years since that has happened. Now, that's 300,000 years, roughly in this range of about 100, with pretty little fluctuation. In 1960, the range, or the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, was about 317 parts per million. As of 2021, the day that I gave this lecture in class, I looked it up that morning, and it was 420 parts per million. Think about how much higher that is than this, for one, which is only, 80 years ago? And then how much higher both of those really are than this historical concentration for hundreds of thousands of years. It's not that the levels that we're at right now are so catastrophically bad. It is a problem, but it's more how rapidly it's increasing, and can we and will we be able to stop that, right? So the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased from less than 300 parts per million to over 320. Well, it's way beyond that. It's over 420 parts per million in the last 100 years. That doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon. So here's a graph just reaching from a little before 1960 to 2005 that's showing that steady increase. Now what you'll see is, and we've got two graphs, and this is where we'll kind of end things. Like I said before, there are periods of highs and lows. Here we've got a graph of global temperature, CO2 concentration, and sea level. You'll notice that all of these look the same, and that they all have a bit of a cycle. What that's implying is that in Earth's history, when global temperatures were high, that corresponded to high CO2 levels. With that, that also corresponded to high sea levels, because as CO2 is higher in the atmosphere, it traps more heat. Temperatures rise. As temperatures rise, polar ice melts, goes back into the oceans, and while it might not seem like, oh, it's just the ice caps, that's a lot of ice. That's a lot of water being added to those oceans. And sea levels then rise. That has much more drastic effects beyond that, but then you'll see that as CO2 concentrations go down, we see changes accordingly. Now, what this graph is showing us is that, yes, we have global spikes, right? So we have seasonal changes, and that actually goes with the seasons as summer and winter. Think about how many trees have leaves versus how many trees don't. When trees are doing photosynthesis and making food, they're actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So we see CO2 lower a little bit actually in summer, at least for us. And so we see these seasonal peaks, but it's going up and up and up and up and up every year. And so really what all this is to say, and I said I was going to go fast and I didn't, I apologize. We'll see if anyone even watches this. All of this said, I just kind of wanted to present you with the basic tools, a basic understanding of kind of what climate change is, but beyond that is what nutrient cycles are and how those factor in, because climate change isn't just some manufactured term necessarily. It's just a set of observations and a set of predictions based on kind of a human alteration to a nutrient cycle or to multiple nutrient cycles, right? So I hope this has been informative, and I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to stop there. Any more of this we can certainly talk about in class. If you have any questions, ask me in person, ask me over email, ask me over Canvas. Now, with this being said, this is the final video lecture of the year. And so if you've made it this far, for one, thank you. I appreciate you greatly. I'm not sure how far these videos are going to make it into the future. Maybe they're one and done. Maybe they'll be used for years to come. So if you've been following along with these and you've made it this far, thank you for your patience. Thank you for being, hopefully, I imagine, a great student, and for just following along. I hope you've learned something along the way. I hope it's been interesting. I hope it's been engaging. And if nothing else, I hope you feel kind of better equipped to handle the scientific trials and tribulations you just as an everyday citizen might see kind of going forward in your life. So I hope you feel informed, and I hope you feel prepared. And of course, again, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. So thank you much. This is Mr. Browdy out. Take care, everybody.